Madu Dios kuhuyep namuk penet jam men de phatte pats ngapshut maya kun het sa gen mo inak tuk muhkun as Dios kuhuyep kaha asis na na alis ko Dios roi rich sa gen mo naga kahen as naga gen mo in shun min de mem kadak pat shonait na ruin nak te gachtsen. Muchísimas gracias a quienes están aquí. Muchas gracias por venir. Muchísimas gracias a Asis, a Alice y a todas las personas que han hecho posible que yo esté aquí. Y bueno, estoy muy emocionada. Gracias por venir realmente. And first of all, I would like to thank Asis and Alice for inviting me to this project and to this beautiful place. And thank you all for being here. I am very nervous and I am very excited to share some ideas about my work. And for sure, I am going to struggle with English because it's the second time I have to speak in English and to speak about these complex ideas, I think. So thank you for your patience. I am a Mixe writer. I am part of an indigenous nation in Mexico, in the south of Mexico. And my native language is Mixe, and Mixe in Mixe is Ayuk, and that means the language of the forest. So I am very comfortable here in the middle of this beautiful place. And I think it's very important to share ideas in this context of the climate crisis that humanity is facing, and it's very important to talk about the future. About not only about one future, it's about the different meaning of future. And as writer, I write in Mixe, in my native language, and I am trying to write in more collective form, trying to avoid this idea of authorship, individual authorship, and trying to learn how to sing and how to learn traditional stories of the Mixe tradition, and try to learn how to use the poetic strategies of my tradition. In this context, colonialism has denied us as indigenous people the possibility of thinking about future. Colonialism has tied us to the past and tradition. I think that past and tradition are very important, but we need to think about future. Since we survive another apocalypse like the colonialism, I think we have many ideas to share with to face the next apocalypse that humanity is facing is climate change. So I'm going to start with the presentation, and since I'm going to talk about indigenous and futures, I want to invite you to think about what indigenous means, the word indigenous, what's the meaning of indigenous. And it is an identity category, or it's a cultural category of how we can know who is an indigenous people. And for me, it's a very complex process because when I was a child, I knew that I was Mixe, but I'm not aware that I am indigenous. Because when I moved to the city, I realized, oh, okay, I am indigenous, and indigenous is not a good thing, and it's a process. So I want to ask what indigenous actually means. I love words, and I love the history of every word. So there are many different words involved to call us as indigenous people. One is indigenous, Indian, native. In other countries, it's aboriginal, and there is different names and different words. But the first the first word that colonialists or that settlers used to call us was Indian. And Indian, it's different from indigenous. It's the same beginning of the word Indi and Indi, but those words are not related. That are very, very different. So Indian is the name of a river, and it's it's beautiful to know that it's originally is the name of a river. It's a word from Sanskrit, and today in Oaxaca, people use the word Indio or Indian as an insult. And I often wonder how the name of a river became an insult. And it's a very interesting story. This river is in the region that today we know as India. And the original word is in Sanskrit is Sindhu. And Sindhu became Indos in Greek, and then in Indio in Romance languages, and Spanish Indio and English Indian. And Christopher Columbus thought that he made a mistake, and he thought he arrived in India, but not, it's just a mistake, and for that reason they started to call us Indian. And then in Mexico, at least for 300 years, Spaniards only use Indian, not indigenous. Indigenous is it's brand new word for us. Only in the 19th century, they started to use indigenous to call us. And indigenous is from Latin. It's a very special word because its meaning depends on the original meaning depends on the context. For Indi, it's there. Genus is born there. And we can use, for example, people who were born in Cape Cod. It's indigenous from Cape Cod. But at the present, it's not the meaning of that word anymore. It's more like there are some nations that we call indigenous and other nations that are not indigenous. It's different at the present. It's a different meaning. And trying to figure out about the meaning of indigenous, I asked myself, this is a picture from Sami people. Sami is an indigenous nation in who their territory is in Norway, Finland, and Russia. And I asked myself, why are they indigenous? Or what features we share, why they are indigenous, and why I am an indigenous woman. And Mixe people, we love basketball. It's and why are we indigenous people? We are very different. For example, I never seen the snow, and for Sami people, snow is very important. I love corn, and Sami people don't eat corn. And more, this is Ainu people. It's an indigenous people in Japan. And it's the same question. Why are there indigenous people? Where a Sami woman, Ainu woman, and myself, what we share to be named indigenous people? And I am trying to answer that question. I want to know because I spend a lot of time trying to deny. I used to say I am Mixe, but I am not indigenous. I am trying to reject that category. And since in my language there is no word for indigenous, we have a word for Mixe people. It's Ayukhoi, the people who speak Ayuk. And there are another word for people who are not Mixe, like Agots. you are Agats, but as Ainu people is Agats, and Zapotec people and Cherokee people are Agats. It's not Mixe. It's different from Indigenous. And then I start to think, what's the feature that we share? What's the reason behind the concept of Indigenous? And when before colonialism, there were many different nations. We can pueblo nations with territory, with different languages, with our own history, our tradition of thinking. And suddenly, when the Spaniards arrived in Mexico and and here was the
British.
The British, yes. And suddenly we became Indian. And we have been, if we establish the beginning of our history, for example, when we domesticated the corn for my people, we have been Mixe people for 10,000 years. It's a long time since then. But suddenly we have been Indians for only 500 years. And we have been Indigenous for only 2,000 years. It's not an essential feature of our being as Mixe people. And for that reason, I think it's not an identity category, because I can live as Mixe without considering me Indigenous. It's only for colonial period who did did it to us or categorized us as Indian. And suddenly all these different languages and different histories and different territories became Indian. And for a Spaniard system, they create a caste system, and there are very different castes: Indian, mestizo, criollo, mulatto, chino, castizo, sambo. There were many different castes. And for national state, for Mexico national state, they created only two categories: Indigena and mestizo or Mexican. And these different for the Spaniards, we were Indians, and for the Mexico national state, we are Indigena. It's a different way of classify us. So I think that Indigenous peoples are stateless nations that have suffered colonialism. It's a political category. If suddenly we, as Mixe people, decide to create a state, we will not be Indigenous anymore. It's a political category. And for that reason, we can, in the future, think in a future that we can stop being Indigenous while still being Mixe, Zapotec, Cherokee, Ainu. It's just it's a category related to the nation states in the world. And my grandmother, who spoke Mixe all her life, did not recognize herself as Indigenous. When I asked her, "Grandmother, are you Indigenous?" She used to say, "I don't know what that is. I am Mixe people. I am not Indigenous." And in many Indigenous languages, there isn't a word for Indigenous. It's different categories. So the Indigenous word itself is a product of colonialism. And I myself did not recognize myself as indigenous until I arrived in the city. Okay, so this is the maps who shows the distribution of languages and nations around the world. And there are more than 5,000 nations in the world, and every nation has a history, a territory, a language, but only 200 nation states. So many nations were trapped into nation states, and were trapped into a nation state is being indigenous. That's the meaning of that word. It's not cultural category. The Sami people, the Ainu people, Cherokee people, and Mixe people, we don't share cultural features. It's only political features. So I think it's very important to think indigenous like just a period of our history, but it's not essential feature. You can see that there is many different nations in Oaxaca, where I am from, and Africa and Oceania. What's the name in English from that continent?
Australia?
The continent?
Oceania.
Yeah. Oceania. Okay. And but these different languages are endangered. According to the Catalog of Endangered Languages of the University of Hawaii, one language dies every 3 months on average. It's I am very worried about that. And according to UNESCO, 50% of languages would have no speakers in 100 years, in this century. But why? Because every nation state is pushing us to abandon our languages and to start to use the language of every nation state. And for that reason, for example, in Mexico, Spanish is the language of the nation state, and here is English. And for that reason, people who speak Spanish here suffered the same situation that I am suffering in Mexico, because here Spanish is a nationless, stateless language. And this extinction of world languages is related to the race of the nation states. I'm going to say something that is very obvious, but humans need to live with other humans. And it's necessary to coordinate this life in common. We need to coordinate. And there are many options to coordinate our life in common. One of the name of that structures that allow us to coordinate our life in common are called, the name is sociopolitical structures. But there are many different sociopolitical structures. For example, tribal structures, it's one of them, and communality structure. It's a word in Spanish. It's comunalidad. It's like communities, but it's different. It's not exactly community, but it's communality. It's different, but it's a kind of a structure. My village, it's organized in that way, with communal, with assemblies in every village, and we had our autonomous government, and it's different from the political parties and that this structure. And there are different ways to coordinate our life in common. Nation state is one of them, just one. But suddenly, 300 years ago, all the world starting to coordinate the life using nation state model, democracy model. But this model, there are only 200 nation states at the present. For that reason, there are many nations without a state. And it's a problem, a big problem, because every state pushes the other nations to disappear, to learn new languages, new way of life. This structure, these social political structures, has an ideological basis. For example, it's like being Mexican is an identity, and it's only a legal status. Because it's the frontiers between countries are set or were set for political reasons, and if there are 50,000 languages and nations in the world, and only 200 nation states called countries, that means that most of the nations in the world are stateless nations. And stated nations, there are a very difficult situation in the relationship between nation states and languages. For example, the French Academy opposed the recognition of regional languages in the Constitution because they said that after 5 centuries, the French language has forged France. Our Constitution points out in the second article the recognition of this evidence. The language of the Republic is French. There is a monolingual ideology behind every nation state. It's one state, one language. And in the United States, there is a movement called English-only movement, and it's an example of these policies. In Mexico, we have the same kind of movement, and they want to recognize only Spanish as the more important language of Mexico. And for that reason, we have many languages without the stateless languages, and for that reason are disappearing. In Mexico, in the 20th century, two scholars, Jose Vasconcelos and Rafael Ramirez, designed policies to erase our languages, indigenous languages. And for example, in educational programs, Rafael Ramirez brought letters and books trying to convince the teachers to not use our languages in the schools. And he wrote, but if you to give them our science and our knowledge, you speak to children in their indigenous language, we will lose faith in you because we would have to incorporate you into our culture again. You will start by using the language of children, then without realizing you will take the costumes of the ethnic social group to which they belong. Then their lower forms of life, and finally you yourself will become an Indian. That is one more person to incorporate to the society. This, I tell you, is not a joke, but a serious thing. The whole life of the people is condensed into a language, so that when you learn a new language, you also acquire new ways of thinking and even new ways of living. That is why I consider it's very important that you know how to teach Spanish as God commands. That is, without translating into the child's language. You must be very careful so that your children not only learn Spanish, but also acquire our costumes and ways of life that are superior to theirs. This is the official policy in Mexico in the last century. For that reason, there are the numbers, the proportion of indigenous speakers of indigenous languages. When the Mexican nation state arose in 1820, the 65% of population spoke an indigenous languages. Many people. And in 2010, it's only 6.5% of the population. So the state killed our languages with our taxes, actually, using the money our taxes. So what is an indigenous language? Are languages spoken by peoples or nations that did not form nation state and suffered colonialism. A language that are not used by federal government. That is the definition of indigenous languages. Like a German linguist used to say, Max Weinreich, indigenous languages are languages without an army and without a navy. It's, again, a political statement. It's very important for me to repeat that. It's not identity. It's not about identity. It's not about cultural futures. It's about political organization. And considering these ideas, I'm going to talk about future, but I want to use the language diversity and the metaphors we use in different languages to talk about future. Because in the Western tradition, there is one idea about future and about time. And we use time and in every language in the world, it's like a universally, it's a universal strategy. We as humans need to use space metaphors to talk about time. It's very difficult to think time without thinking in space. And for example, in Spanish, and I think in English too, time is a horizontal line. We draw lines, and the future is ahead, and the past is behind. In Spanish, people used to say like, forget your ex-boyfriend, he is in the past. You have a bright future in front of you. But time is not space. Time it's a different concept, but we need to use space to talk about time. And in Spanish, it's a horizontal line. But in another languages like Aymara, it's an indigenous language, language without an army behind. In Peru, it's spoken in Peru. Time is a horizontal line too. But since we know the past is ahead and the future is behind. We can see the future. Yeah. It's another way of speak about time. And that is, it's more logical because past, I know the past, it's in front of me. And I don't know anything about the future, so it's behind. And it's also a line. In Miye, in my native language, time it's a line too, but it's vertical. And when we are talking about future, the future is above, and time comes down through the bodies. It's like the mem kadak. And I am just waiting for time passing through my body. It's different. And in Spanish and in English, we use movement to for example, I am going to think, but you are not going to anywhere. It's just I am going to. It's a movement. It's a verb about movement. And in Spanish, it's the same. It's voy a pensar, but where? You are just in your chair pensando. And in Mixe, in another languages like Zapotec, the time is like a spiral, and it's going in circles. So when we are talking about future, what future we are thinking about in the future of English and Spanish, or Mixe future, or future in cycles? What is future? And for that reason, it's important the language diversity, but we can see the future, the world in different ways. And it's very important to me to talk about this. So I want to talk about the future of the art and of literature. And for that, but first I want to talk about, I want to establish a difference between poetic function and aesthetic function and art and literature. Poetic function seeks to create an experience that breaks with ordinary time of language, and aesthetic experiences using language. I can use a piece of wood to create a sculpture, or I can use wood to create a chair, for example. And I can use language to say something. For example, give me a cup of coffee, please, or I need more alcohol. But I can use language to create an aesthetic experience. And that experience, of that use of language, I call poetic function. And Roman Jakobson, a Russian linguist, says that the poetic functions focuses on the message. The poetic function of language is to highlight the message itself. It seeks an aesthetic effect in the use of language. And poetic function, it's different from literature. Poetic function, it's a linguistic phenomena in all language around the world. It's a temporal. For example, 2,000 years ago, people use poetic function, and it's universal. In every language, we can find manifestations of poetic function. And literature is culturally bounded, it's historically defined, and only in some hegemonic languages. Literature needs a social recognition system who says you are a writer. And to publish a book, or publishing a book, it's very important. It's the most important ritual, I think, because I think I can say I write a poem every day, but if nobody read that, or if I not publish my poems, I'm not a writer. I need social recognition. There are prizes like Nobel Prize for literature, and residencies like this, and that says you are a writer. I recognize that you are a writer. And art and the poetic function of the manifestations is a commodity. I can go to a store and buy a book with poems inside. This is obvious, but for me, in my tradition, it's not obvious, because I can't buy the poems or the songs of my tradition. It's weird to think in buy that. And in the Western tradition, at the present, authorship, individual authorship, is very important. I think West is obsessed with this idea. There are laws, special laws, a legal frame to protect your rights, because it's a commodity, and it's weird if you think about it. And there are laws protecting property rights, and the artworks are closed. If I want to, I don't know, to change or to change one paragraph of this book, maybe, what's the author? Ben can I can get a call from his lawyers because I am changing her art. And there is also a relationship between literature and capitalism. Cristina Rivera Garza and John Guillory argues the relationship between literature and the bourgeoisie. And I think it's important to pointing out this because literature is the poetic function of the bourgeoisie. Yeah. It's the manifestation. But there are many different systems. For example, in the, I left this in Spanish, sorry, but we need rituals to know what piece of text or what piece of language are literature or are poetic. For example, in literature, writing is very important. We use the word writer to name an artist who work with language. But in my tradition, in Mixe tradition, writing is not important. It's memory. And for that reason, they call it oral tradition. But it's not about oralization, it's about memory. Our piece of paper, or our screen, it's our memory. It's like a piece of paper when we create poetical pieces. But for literature, writing is very important. And in literature, the authorship is individual authorship. It's very important to know that information. But in Mixe tradition, it's collective property. Nobody can say who is the authorship of our mythology, our traditional stories. There is no individual authorships. We know that it's Mixe, but it's a collective authorship. And in literature, publication, or to publish, it's very important. It's like a ritual, and there is presentations, and there are alcohol, and and it's like, if you think about like a ritual, you can, like anthropologists, you can describe. And in this point, the author is in the table with his friends, and they present the book and then drink alcohol. No? And in that moment, you become an author, a writer. But in Mixe tradition, it's the age, and if you are related to rituals, to our religion. And for example, as a linguist, I know the strategies to build a poetical text. And I know, but I am not old enough to do that. Nobody will ask to me to do some ritual and use poetical text. The age is very important. And there are many different versions of one piece art, or one poetical piece. For example, there are many different versions of the legend about a traditional hero called Condoy. There are many different versions of the same story, but there aren't many different versions of this book. It's one version. But in Mixe tradition, there are many different at the same time. In one version, the hero buy a car. In another version, buy gold, and another version buy a Volkswagen, a car, and they are at the same time different. So in our tradition, we need social recognition. There is a social recognition system But if I am involved in traditional rituals in our religions, I can use that poetic words, that poetic construction. I need to be related to rituality. The property, it's collective property, as is open. These manifestations are open. I can, it's like jazz, actually. And it's interdisciplinary development because music is involved, the voice is involved, dance is involved. It's not just poetry, like in the Western tradition. I can read a poem by myself in solitude here in the barn. But in Mixe tradition, we need a ritual, we need music, we need a person who sings the text, the oral text, and it is different. And I was reading about the interdisciplinary development of art for Western tradition. It is very new, but it's a new idea, and I think, but for me, that's traditional, too traditional. And there are specialists to exercise the poetic function. In every tradition, there are communal specialists who tell the stories or sing poetry. And there is a special name for that. In Western is a writer, a poet, but in the past time, it's bard. In Africa, jele, minstrel, juggler. There are different names for that. And there are different cultural requirements, for example, ritual, age, gender. In the Miye tradition, only women can create poetry. It's interesting. Men are not allowed to do that. But in other tradition, only men. But Pai Pai, it's an indigenous nation in Baja California, in the north of the country. And when I went there to record the traditional stories of Pai Pai because there are only 20 persons who speak Pai Pai. It's very endangered. And they use poetic function only in winter. When I asked them, can you tell us a story, a traditional story? And they answered, we can't because we are in summer. And I say, why? And they say because snakes get angry and they can bite us. We need to wait until winter arrived. And I suddenly realized that I understand why, because in summer there are a lot of work to do. And in winter, it's very cold winter. We can spend time with fire in the middle of the house and told that stories. And it's very interesting. It's like there is a specific season to tell the traditional corpus or the traditional corpora of stories. And there are different strategies. In the Western tradition, metaphors are very, very important. Yeah. He wrote a book about the strategies to convert language into something poetic, that called the poetic Aristotle. And but in different language, there are many different strategies to convert everyday language into poetic piece of art. And in Mixe tradition, repetition is very, very important. As you can see, I am repeat again the same information, because when I for example, if I am telling a story, the most important part of a story, I need to repeat it 3 times. And if you repeat 3 times, it's beautiful than if you don't do that. And we use diffracism, and diffracism is as important to us as metaphors for the Western tradition. And diffracism is like this. In the non-poetical level, tsun, it's a verb, and that means to sit down. And tan, it's to stand up. Hukyat is to live in a non-poetical level. But if I want to use in poetic level, I can combine tsun with tan, and that means live. I am sitting down, I am stand up, and that means to live. And another example, hui, it's to melt, tar, it's to rain, and yaosh is to cry in non-poetical level. But in poetical level, I can combine hui with tar, and that means to cry, but in poetic level. And there are many, many of these diffracisms and are very poetic. And I am trying to write about these strategies and trying to learn how to construct that, because it's difficult. But I'm not. I need to get elder to use that in the rituals. And the genres in literature, we have novel and poetry and different genres, but also in our tradition we have different genres, poetic genres. Like in Zapotec, it's an indigenous language from Oaxaca. There are 4 different genres. Libana, it's like traditional discourses. It's not exactly that, but it's Dichagola, like proverbs, Ryunda, poems and songs, and Dijaguka, stories or traditional stories. And we have our classification. And since our poetry, our literature, or our manifestations of poetic function are open, and we can change every time we want. It's very similar to the jazz music. Marshall McLuhan said that the jazz musician used all the techniques of oral poetry. Empathic identification with all the oral modes, it's not difficult in our century, because when I listen to Autumn Leaves, every time I listen is different, because the improvisation changed that piece, that song, that music, but it's the same at the same time. It's like our stories. It's the same situation with our stories. Every time when a person tells the story, change something. It's the same structure, it's the same story, but it's not the same story. Every time is changing. And for example, Anaceli Palma is the granddaughter of a very famous singer, Tarahumara singer, Rarámuri singer, an indigenous nation in the north of Mexico. And she wrote about her grandfather's work. And she says, the Rarámuri writer, it's not writer because they don't use writing, but the Rarámuri writer does not imagine himself as a writer. His first job is to sing, and singing is a community act whose service no one questions because it's as necessary as any other. And that is very important. But here in the Western tradition, a writer or a poet are very special persons. But we, as every society needs a doctor and an engineer and poets who sing and who can curate our souls. So in another tradition, like Mixe tradition, poetry is related to curation, when it's related to rituals, to weddings, to funerals. And we can listen to poetry or Mixe poetry in those contexts. And it's very, very important for the everyday life. With COVID, this pandemic, that was very sad because the elder are not allowed to go to the funerals. So many people was buried without poetry, and that was very, very sad for us. And for that reason, poetry has a social function in our societies. In Western too, but it's different. It's very related to capitalism and to commodities. It's art as commodity. And when we talk about other futures, can we talk about a future in which the poetic function is not marked by capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy? And in Western tradition or poetic function or literature, can we return to poetic function without literature? I think that we can do that again because, for example, Homer, the Iliad. How do you pronounce? The Iliad. The Iliad was built inside another structure, more in poetic function. One famous epic poem called the Poema de Mio Cid in Spanish. It's anonymous, but anonymous is a code word for collective authorship. And I think it's important to think in these futures. And for that reason, we can think about indigenous futurism without indigenous category, just different nations without nation states. And Afrofuturism is a very important movement here, and it's important to think about the future, trying to imagine a world without capitalism and without patriarchy and without colonialism. But it's difficult to think about. But I think in the future we can think about collective futurism, collective aesthetics without individual authorship, and poetic function without capitalism. And I am involved in a collective called COLMIX. And we are trying to write and to use our memory as piece of paper and trying to create poetry without authorship. And it's very interesting, and we think it's important to do that, to think that we can create art without without convert it in commodity. And I am thinking about collective poetic manifestations and poetic manifestation that not become commodities, collective authorship, and creation related to specific ecosystems. And I think it's important because if I want to use another tradition, I can use it like only like resources, cultural resources, and I appropriate that traditions to my, and to translate it into commodity, and it's dangerous. And for that reason, I try to create in collective always, and we don't use our names in that creations, and we are trying to use our memory, because in Western schools, memory is like you need to understand, not only learn something by heart, but for us it's very important to know, to learn different things by heart, because our memory are important to us. And this is the disco. Muchas gracias. Thank you. It's the idea about the future.